Hey, friend, it's Aranza Savas, and I'm so excited to welcome you to this episode of the Uplifters podcast. I'm talking to author Melissa Petro about her new book, Shame on You, How to Be a Woman in the Age of Mortification. I learned so much from this book. I learned so much about myself from this conversation. We're going to talk about what happens when we are shamed, both in public and in private, how we internalize cultural messages about who and what we're allowed to be, and most importantly, how we reclaim our stories and live our boldest, bravest, most authentic lives. It gets a little weird. I say things I've never said publicly before. I'm recording this opening a few days after our conversation, after some shame cycles and some fear and some worry and some decisions that I want to keep living with less shame. So I'm really grateful I got to read Melissa's book, to have this conversation with her. And I'm especially grateful that I get to share it all with you. I hope this sparks some new conversations among all of us. I feel like I've been hanging out with you for the last 24 hours with your voice. So we've gone for a run. We've done dishes. We've cleaned the house. We put away all the laundry that I hadn't been putting away because I was like, I got to keep going on this book.
We're besties.
We're
I didn't
totally
even know it.
besties, even though you have no idea who I am or that I exist, which is sort of a weird trip. And I'm super stoked to be with you here. I think it's very rare, but every once in a while we get to read something that really opens up our lens to see our own lives and our own perspectives in new ways. And reading your book has been very much like that for me.
What a beautiful thing to share. Thank you.
I mean, and I was glad you acknowledged this in the book because shame is not something that I think about a lot. It's not a word I use often. It's not a feeling. And I know, again, you talk about this in the book, how difficult that feeling can be to describe and what the
Because
embodied
we're
sense of it is.
ashamed.
Ashamed to have
We're
shame.
ashamed that we have shame. So instead of saying we feel ashamed, we might say we feel inadequate or we need to do better. That's kind of permissible. But I even circled that word for so long. It was suggested to me by my agent. You know, what is your memoir? It was then memoir. What is it about? I just didn't know. And I think early in the process, she's like, maybe it's about shame. No. No, it's something else. And then 2 years later, really.
Oh, that's so interesting because your story begins, of course, with that moment of public shaming when you wrote about your past sex work, and it was connected then to your former, then current work as an elementary school teacher in New York City, and sort of the takedown and the public shaming that ensued as a result of public perceptions of what women should be, what teachers should be, what sex work is. And so my assumption was that it was in that moment and in that story that you started to say, dang it, no, I won't be shamed.
And sometimes
I will reclaim my voice.
Sometimes I was in that empowered place. And I mean, I knew what was happening was wrong. I knew I felt humiliated. I don't know if I would have used that word. That's awfully vulnerable to admit then. I knew it was unjust intellectually what was happening to me. I had written about it. You know, it was no surprise that I was being treated unfairly as a woman, and that the idea that I was both a sexual being and a serious, public servant, the idea that was incompatible. I mean, I knew that this was alarming to some. I had thought about it, but, to feel it on that level and to live in a place of empowerment and that the awareness, no, I didn't stay in that place all the time. I blamed myself. I thought, for years, what could I have done differently to have avoided this, the relentless humiliation? I was stupid or not strategic enough. I couldn't control the narrative in that moment. I came off looking however I felt I looked. I looked not the way I wanted to look. I wasn't in control of my image and my story. And that felt like a personal failing. And I felt ashamed. Often, for years, I felt ashamed of what happened to me. I did not know then that I felt ashamed. I only knew that I didn't want to feel this way, and what could I do to feel differently? And I have to write my book, and I have to publish a book, and that'll give me the validation I was seeking.
And make it all make sense.
It kind of did a little, to be honest.
You know?
Profoundly validating.
There is something about that, right? Like in reclaiming our stories and seeing them. And this is, I'd say, again, we're over 100 stories have been shared here about women's challenges and change making. And that is one of the key themes, is that when we have the courage to own and acknowledge and share our stories and see them create impact and healing for others, it begins to allow us to find peace and healing within them.
We begin to reclaim that narrative.
Yeah.
And I fought to maintain control of it the whole while. But part of reclaiming our narratives is acknowledging our vulnerabilities and our powerlessness. And at times we are not in control, neither of our narratives nor of, everything influencing the choices we make. And we do make mistakes. So I didn't have a real right-sized view until I was able to tell that whole story on my terms with the support of a publisher and people telling me, people paying me for it. That was quite necessary in some ways. It wasn't just, it was the other people looking at me and telling me that this story is important and you do need to share it. And of course I got that over the years in smaller settings, people assuring me that what happened to me was wrong and I have the right to tell my story. I have permission to share it. And not only do I have that right, but it's valuable, it's useful. Other people need to hear this story. That spurred me on for a very long time.
Yeah. And not even just the specifics of your story, which I think are really important and way more far reaching than, I think particularly around women's relationships with the sex industry. I think there's far more experience around that than we acknowledge, and we can talk about that more. But I also think that beyond all of that, it's all of these other feelings of inadequacy and fear and shame that hold us back and keep us small and keep us in a place of self-limiting. But one of the most fascinating things you said so far, and one maybe the most surprising, was connecting that the shame from that time actually comes from not feeling in control of your story, not from what they were shaming you for.
Right.
Because that was in weakness, not having control.
Right. And then sometimes there's a tendency, if we're being villainized, you might feel a temptation to lean into that character that they're portraying you as. It's fawning in a way. I'll just be what you think I'm an asshole. I'll be an asshole. And in that way, we kind of reclaim, or seemingly we reclaim, or we claim an appearance of power. But no, powerlessness is really terrifying for us. Right. And I did a lot of in researching the book, really realizing, why do we feel ashamed when we are victimized? Well, one, we want to avoid it from happening again. Why do we shame others when they're victims? Well, we don't want to think of ourselves as ever being weak enough to find ourselves in that position. If she did something wrong and that's why it's happening to her, I won't do something wrong and it won't happen to me. So that's why we really live in a society where we're constantly pointing fingers at others and saying what you needed to do differently. It's an individual problem rather than looking at the other factors that are sometimes harder to control. We think we can control ourselves and our behaviors and, just, dress right and don't drink too much and then it won't happen to you. But it's not. It's never our fault when someone harms us.
Yeah. And you in the book share a lot of stories of women who have been villainized in the media specifically. And it struck me as I listened to those examples collectively that a big piece of why they felt so captivating and scary is because they were just one degree of difference from how we saw ourselves. And it felt like at any minute we could be that woman. And I think that's part of how we keep ourselves in the state that we're in of being small and being not fully expressed, because there is this fear that if I make one wrong move or I get in one wrong position, I could become the villain.
Right. So we end up siding with the perpetrator rather than the victim because it seems safer and we're protected so long as we follow these rules. We won't ever become victimized like she did. The problem is that the rules are impossible to follow. And I really discovered that,
I want the section where you go through what is in essence predating the Barbie speech,
yeah,
America
I knew
Ferrera.
exactly where you were going. And I was
I
like,
was like, can
"It's
we
Barbie."
please have Melissa Petro and her Barbie speech on repeat everywhere? Because every freaking word of it is true, Melissa.
And we all know it. It's so
Yes.
familiar. We all know what we can and cannot be, and we all know how absurd it is, because then there is nothing you can be, because there's rules are so contradicting and impossible. Even if you want to follow them, which oftentimes we don't, we want to go against that grain. They're not just. We recognize that. But let's say even if we were trying to follow those rules, it becomes so impossible and exhausting. And I didn't really realize this. I didn't realize it when I worked in the sex trades. I thought that was obviously going against the grain and I would be shamed for that. But then years later, when I transitioned out of the industry and became a mother, here it was again. The same surveillance and scrutiny and impasse. I could not get it right. And here I was doing, I thought, everything right. I'd become exactly who you want me to be, which in a way I had also become that as a public school teacher. But it was not, it was a losing game. I recognized that finally. That was like the real moment where I was like, oh, this is really, and then actually there was a moment, like I'd said, that my agent helped lead me to the word shame, that this is a book about shame. When my son started presenting as special needs, then I really wasn't going to be a good parent. I'm using like scare quotes. Like I was never going to follow the rules as what a mother was supposed to, because my child didn't, and bad kids, quote unquote, mean bad parents. And I actually did not give a fuck at that point, because my son needed me to show up for him, and I let go of so much. And it was so freeing. I almost didn't even need to publish the book anymore. But then I was like, oh, this is what this book is about. Wow. Letting go of all of that pressure and all of that impossibility, and saving face for who, for what?
Right. For who, for what? And I think one of the most damaging things about this, at least for me personally, and I think I hear this in a lot of stories, is this: because we hide, we never feel fully seen or fully known. And therefore we can't be fully loved, and we can't trust the relationships that we have to endure. And that leaves us feeling incredibly alone. And so I've talked to other guests about this, that like when I got together with my husband, it was like daring him. So I was like, and I did this, and I've done this, and this, and this. And he was just like, wow, great. You're a really nice person. I really like you.
I was
like,
also,
yeah, but also.
I also introduced myself in that way. Like, let me tell you the very worst things about me and see if you're going to reject me. Because if you do, let's just get that shit over with. So I don't get attached. And I learned, the less shameful those things felt, the more they could kind of wait. I started by the time I met my husband, it was like, okay, fourth date material. We'll start talking about that. Let him get an idea of who I am before he has to contemplate something. He might not have thought too hard about sex work politics in his life. So let's give him a date or two to get to know me. But yeah, we do want to lead with those things, because if you're going to love me, you're going to have to love this about me too. And this is a hard thing to wrap your brain around. Yeah. Whatever it is. And when I say that, I don't just mean sex work. I mean any conceivable stigmatized identity, any past that is presumably abnormal, individualized and pathologized, and it just makes us feel different with a capital D.
Yeah.
Those are the things we got to get out, right?
Different versus special.
Right. And there are people who can just go through life with those things tucked neatly inside. And I'm not one of those people. I need to be seen, heard, and understood. Like, let's make sure you can see, hear, and understand me. And to do that, you got to know about these things, and I bring them right out. Yeah, that's how I live my life.
I suspect you have a greater sense of intimacy and length of connection with the people in your life as a result of that.
We get right to it. I don't have any time for people that make small talk. Or Brené Brown talks about you don't want to trauma dump, and that trauma bonding is not intimacy either. And I respect that. Like I said, I started to learn how to kind of a little bit more composed with my story and my presumably shameful secrets. But I do believe that these presumably shameful facts about us really are like the meat of life. This is like the human experience that we're just not talking about. So I am the type that will, like, we're going to be talking, you're going to be in tears and I'm going to be in tears, and we're going to be sharing the deepest heartfelt, you're my bestie by the end of the coffee, because I met you standing in line at Starbucks. Those are the kind of conversations I want to have, like, all the time, because I think that's really what life is about. Like, the things that make us joyous and despair and everything in between. Like, why are we wasting time, like, with being polite? Or I don't know, like, that's not me.
Well, yeah. I mean, I just feel like, again, it comes back to trust for me. I don't feel like I can trust people I don't know and who don't know me. When I saw your bio when we first connected, I was like, oh, this is really interesting, because I have somebody I work with, one of my clients, who on our very first session, very successful person, quite well known in her own right. And she was like, just so you know, I have a history as a sex worker. And we've talked a lot about her shame related to this. And I was like, that's cool. I mean, I was a stripper in high school for a while. I did not have a good experience. I don't talk about it. So maybe I have shame. I don't know. I don't talk about it because I don't know. I guess I feel shame. I feel like it's stigmatized.
No, you
It was
may
also
not.
just it was a terrible experience. I felt like really degraded and really gross and really icky. And I would think I was feeling lots of shame under the male gaze more than I was about, like, an interpretation of what sex workers do. And I also never thought of it as sex work. I just thought I like worked at baby dolls for a brief period in high school. It was like 2 weeks.
If you can get fired for that, then you can that probably counts.
That probably counts. Yeah. But I just really haven't thought a lot about it. And that woman, because we had that conversation right at the outset, it is one of the most intimately powerful coaching relationships I've ever had. Because every time we talk about something that feels ugly or shameful, or like you shouldn't think it or say it or feel it, we are able to meet on this place of, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to interpret that. I admire you and think the freaking world of you. And I just want to know what you think. And also, I feel better for having thoughts that I don't feel great about.
Right. And those are such healing relationships. I just want to say all of our triggers are different. So there are people with experiences in the sex trades who don't think twice about it. They didn't internalize it the way that I did. For me, it was like that grain of sand in the oyster. It was just bothersome. And I was just wrapping things around it, trying to make it better. And ultimately I did make meaning of it, but it was such a meaningful experience and such a burden for me. And all of our burdens, all of our shame is different. Some people are really burdened by, a lot of women are burdened by appearance, issues of weight. Yeah, I really wasn't until I started getting older. And now I'm like, oh, wait. Oh, I just had, like, quote unquote pretty privilege for so long. I'm just like, like, now I'm losing something. Interesting. And so like I write in the book, it might not bother you at all to walk into a dressing room and have to try on a bathing suit, but chances are it does, because a lot of women experience enormous amounts of self-judgment in that experience. And it's not unique to you. It's not a defect of personality. If you do have a certain trigger, that trigger has probably been planted in there. Our culture has conditioned us to think there's something wrong with us. If you have experiences in the sex trade, or if you have money problems or sex and relationship issues, all of these things we don't talk about because we've been taught there's something wrong with you. And then when we start to talk to each other and we realize, oh, it's not unique, it's not individual, I'm not the only one, it's quite liberating.
Liberating is the right word. because it frees us from the constraints that we have internalized about our own stories. And one of the things that I think is really interesting in your book is you talk about the dual nature of shame. As I was listening, of course, I was doing what I think, hope all humans do, that it is to listen to these things and think, well, what does this mean in my life? What does this look like in my life? What am I learning from this? What is its relevance? And I was thinking about that experience in high school, which I was dancing at baby dolls because I'd run away from home to smoke crack and live in a hotel room. Now, that whole period of my life, which sounds really dramatic and intense, lasted less than a month.
Mhm.
But it was shame that saved my life. And I really do believe my life was saved. My life could have gone a much different direction, but some woman came and said, you're going to break your grandma's heart if you don't come home. And the fear and shame of embarrassing my grandmother, of disappointing my grandmother, meant that I was like, all right, let's go hard one more night and then go home. And I did. So let's chalk that up to the extraordinary power of love. But also it was shame that saved my life in that instance.
I want to encourage you to think of it as guilt.
Yes. Yeah, that's funny. I was thinking about that distinction too. Yeah.
Because you didn't think, oh, this is who I am.
It was guilt.
I can't do any. My grandmother.
Yes.
I can't be someone else. This is who I am. I'm a drug addicted whore. You didn't internalize that behavior.
No,
You were like,
I did not think that's who I was. I was like still a really good girl with straight A's.
Instead, you're like, no, I'm actually fundamentally good, but this behavior is wrong and it will disappoint my grandmother and I love her. And so and it's not right. She's correct. You didn't, it wasn't who you were. It was what you were doing. And so when it's something that we're doing, it's much easier to change. But if it's who we are, then that's shame. We feel ashamed of who we are, not what we're doing. It's so much harder to change. This is why shame isn't ever really a positive thing. We can feel guilty about our conduct and change our behavior, but when you feel ashamed of who you are and account for what you're doing as it's indicative of this deep, dark wrongness, that is very, very difficult then to change your behavior.
Yeah.
And that's why so many people who are drug users or who are behaving in ways that is societally unpopular and harmful to themselves and potentially others, that's why it's so hard for them to turn around because they're being told they're just, shit
They're
people.
bad. Yeah. And I think it goes back to that villainous response that you talked about. Yeah. If you want to tell me I'm bad, then I'll be bad.
Right. And I just, I'll just be the best bad person I could be, or just enjoy it, or just drown the shame with more shameful behaviors that numb us or that feel pleasurable at the time, or, it becomes this terrible, terrible cycle. And I'm so grateful that you were able to lift out of there. And you probably had a lot of resilient factors in your life that helped confirm for you that you were a decent person who was making choices that felt wrong.
Yeah, that's right. And there was definitely a foundation there that made it much easier. And I think genetically I'm not predisposed to addiction.
Yeah.
And so I just think that I had so many factors that supported me in that choice. And I was so freaking fortunate. And literally, I think this is the loudest I've ever talked about any of it. And so it was like, for me, this whole detangling as I listened to your book between these ideas of guilt and shame and their role within this. And then I was thinking too, still on that idea of the dichotomy of shame, what we're learning about it now on a larger cultural spectrum, right? So it was like 2020, all these companies, for fear of shame, started, I think, at least this is my perception, started passing all of these rules about DEI programs and being more equitable and more supportive of differences. And then now when we're seeing a change in the cultural tide, it feels to me like all of those decisions were made simply out of an unsustainable running from a shaming. And that's why we're seeing such a quick change back over to, we don't do DEI anymore. We're over that. Next. We're not afraid of being shamed.
So I'm
So we're
very
ending the
suspicious
program.
of shame as a tool, political tool, that we can
Yeah.
shame people into behaving differently. I think money talks for
Uh,
companies, and I think you can convince a company that it's in their economic interest to
mhm,
behave a certain way. But I don't believe in our capitalistic society that these companies are influenced by ideology so much
mhm.
as economic motivation.
Aren't those linked though?
I mean, they if an ideology is popular, then it's probably in their economic interest
Yes.
to adapt that ideology. And so I think there was an adoption of diversity and the appearance of tolerance. And Target with their Pride Month displays
Mhm.
sold a lot of rainbow t-shirts, and that's their goal, is to sell
Yeah.
t-shirts. If it has a rainbow on it, okay. If it has something else, that's whatever. Doesn't matter to them. I mean, companies are not people with hearts, but you and
I do
I
think
are.
though. Yeah. Well, and I think though companies, influencers,
Mhm.
individuals across the board, we saw people saying like, I believe in this. This is important
People are
when there was
so
fear of
influenced.
being called out. And then once it's like no longer popular, it's
Mhm.
like, okay, now back to normal.
Right. Now, people will fawn to what's popular.
Yeah.
And that's really what I encourage in my work for us to challenge. What do you believe?
Mhm.
Not what's popular necessarily, but what do you know to be true? And
Mhm.
it's very hard in a culture of shame to even know what we believe and what our goals are. And we're always being told what we're supposed to desire, what we're supposed to work towards, who we're supposed to be. We're getting inundated constantly with messages of what is right. It's hard within all that noise to really think, what do I believe is right? These
Mhm.
messages have been instilled in us since we were tiny. It's so hard, and it's so hard to look at your culture and say what you think is wrong. And we're living in a bizarro time right now, right? Where like the right is wrong and the wrong is right.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it can feel so alienating. Shame is the feeling that you are
Mhm.
so unworthy that we will not love you or take care of you. You do not belong to this society. And there's nothing more terrifying than to think you won't be accepted. So we're very susceptible to that influence. What can I say or do so that you'll accept me? So I do think when you start talking about influencers, now we're talking about people, and now we're talking about you and I are influencers to
Yeah.
an extent, right? Part of it is economically driven.
Mhm.
This is our job and we're paid for it. And part of it is what we truly believe in. And we do have to reconcile that. And we all do. Every
Mhm.
human being is walking around. How do I see that my needs are being met and that I feel like I belong and I'm taken care of by this society, but also stand up for what I believe in, stand up for victims when I think they're being harmed, and go against someone potentially more powerful than I because it is what I believe to be true and right. We're constantly being confronted with that every day. And yeah, it's really hard. In a culture of shame, you're going to receive a lot of messages about who you should be and what you should do that might not align with what you believe you should
Mhm.
be and do.
Mhm. And then the goal then is to use our own compass to
Yes.
make those decisions from a place of authenticity.
Right. And so part of that is really aligning with people who affirm us and affirm what we
Mhm.
believe to be true. So really finding and cultivating those relationships, curating your timeline, which is not to say that we don't want to allow diversity of opinion into our timeline, but if something is reinforcing a shame trigger, get that shit
Mm.
out of there. I
Mhm.
really do not need to follow so many plastic surgeons. I don't know how that happened, but I need to unfollow that shit because I don't have $200,000 for a facelift, and this plastic surgeon's telling me that I need one. I don't need to hear that.
No. No, that's really
That
not
it
helpful.
tithes my energy. I have so much more to give than any
Mhm.
thought to that. right? So all of
Mhm.
the things that just sort of insidiously tax our power and autonomy
Mm.
as human beings, get that shit out of there. Set a boundary. Do not let that family member undermine you as they do, which is not to say, oh, shame on you that you're letting it get to you, because that's
Right.
like a huge
Right.
lesson I had to learn. Like, even though I'm a very, very smart person, I still feel shame. Even though I know a lot about shame, I still experience this very human emotion. What I'm saying is actually it will get to you.
Yeah.
So how do we stop it from even getting to us? Really, like, being mindful about the influences we allow into our lives, and that we really go where it's warm.
Into those spaces of acceptance.
The spaces that are really going to accept our authentic selves. And then when we can be our authentic self, we encourage other people to be their authentic selves, and we create more authentic communities. And I don't care what your authentic self is. I don't care what you believe. I've worked with hundreds of writers, many with opinions that I disagreed with. Okay, articulate that. Help us understand what you believe and who you are. I seek to understand, and I come with a curious mind. And if we come from that place, we can find what we do agree on. And then we can have like these really important, oftentimes difficult conversations about what we do disagree on. Shame-free conversations.
Mm-hmm. And that, I think, starts with you being curious and inviting that open conversation instead of immediately passing judgment, which is what we're going to do when we feel under fire.
Right. So we're talking about being vulnerable versus purporting to be invulnerable and, being defensive. If we could just be a little softer and less afraid that someone, and like, I'm not saying like walk around with your deepest wounds like splayed out for all to see and nothing bad will ever happen. I'm kind of like a poster child for actually shit does happen when you're honest. I lost my career for speaking the truth of my past. It can happen. We can be hurt. If it's a small conversation, we develop resilience. The more we turn towards people who receive us positively, the more we have those positive experiences, the more resilient we are to negative ones. I have people who look at me like I'm a hemorrhoid because I say the thing, and they're not my people. So I move on. I find someone else who can hear the thing, and then we're having that deep, meaningful conversation. It also, like, it is a privilege to like be authentic, right? Some of us don't have the privilege to just be our true selves at work. We wear uniforms, figuratively and literally. But find the places where you can be yourself and really like just bask in that experience as often as we can.
Yeah, I was thinking about having this conversation with you today and sharing the story that I did, which, like I said, I've never talked about openly or loudly, maybe with a few individuals, but not on this platform at all. And I really thought to myself, like, okay, what's the worst that could happen? Well, the worst that could happen is, I don't know. I don't think people are not going to listen to the show because of this and not hear these other stories. Like, who cares? These stories are not even about me. Somebody might see that I am a person who has lived and had experiences. That's not so bad. Maybe there will be people who I can't think of anything all that terrible, right? And yet our fear response keeps us in place because we haven't really looked at what are we afraid of here. And I thought, well, what's the best that could happen? And the best is that there are people who embrace more of their whole selves and feel more seen, and I could connect more deeply with people. And so I think that's one of the major themes in this book, and certainly in this conversation, is that the advantages, yes, you lost a career, but unbeknownst to you, you were creating an entirely different career,
Right.
one that allowed you to be more fully expressed, seen, more impactful, reach more people, and leave more of a positive legacy with your short little time on this earth.
Right. And I think that if you do have the privilege to be out, like, do that shit for people who don't. Because the more we make it permissible, have a complicated past or even a complicated present, the more that we create a tolerance as a society where we can, instead of shaming individuals with those experiences, we can turn to them with some neutrality and some understanding, because when something is shamed and we're silenced, there's no understanding about that experience. We don't have like a huge amount of current sex workers engaging in public conversations about their lives because though it's criminalized. It's self-incrimination to step forward. And as a result, our legislation, our policies, and those public conversations are just uninformed. And this is true not just about sex work or any of these stigmatized or shameful, presumably shameful experiences, are just uninformed because we're not talking about it because we're ashamed.
Right. And we're staying silent. And so I think one of the questions I had as I read your book was you were pushed down and criticized and alienated and shamed, all with the goal of making you be quiet.
Right.
And I think we all have our own moments of that in our lives, that we end up playing small and withholding our truth and operating outside of integrity because we're afraid we can't recover. How did you get out of the freaking hole and reclaim your voice and own your story?
I don't ever want to underestimate how difficult that was, that period. And like I said at the start, for a long time, I felt very ashamed that I hadn't taken a more defiant stance, that I had resigned. Why didn't I go to trial or fight forever? So in some sense, I did surrender because those institutions were just so much more powerful than I was. I wasn't going to keep my job. I wasn't going to win that fight. They were intent on silencing me, on shutting me up. And I had to acquiesce in a way to a reality that it wasn't my students' fight. It was a distraction to the community. And I think survivors need to hold themselves to account for their part. We talked about victim blaming and blaming oneself, but there always is a sort of we do have some agency even in our most powerless moments. And so I think for me, really owning what I could have done differently, how I wanted to move forward, did I want to be right or did I want to be happy? Did I want to be safe? And really acknowledging what I was powerless over helped me to move forward with what felt like grace in those moments, as difficult as they were. And then following, one step after another, that path of truth I felt led me out of the immediate trauma, that acute experience. I did in some ways surrender to keep myself safe. And I knew, as painful as that was, that it was the right decision for myself. And then in some sense, I didn't surrender because I just doubled down on my belief that we have the right to share our stories and that sharing our stories is our salvation, individually and societally. This is the way we go. So committing to that, I kind of did become unemployable. And so I had to figure something out. And I'm a creative person. So I kept writing. I teach transformative language arts. I'm a hustler. So for a long time, I would do whatever to survive and to stay true to that belief. I had a therapist at the time and I was dating a guy at the time. And she said, you could get married and take his name and just move on. And I knew I could not do that. What terrible, terrible advice. That was not the way. Maybe some people can and do, and that is the way they move forward with integrity. But for me, I couldn't do that. I wanted to own all of me and live all of me out loud. And I wanted that to be the message. And so I really committed to it. It took me so long to actually write and sell a book, but that was always that was what I needed to do. And thankfully, going back again to the beginning, it began as a memoir and it became so much more than just my story. I was able to interview 150 plus, mostly women, about their own run-ins with this feeling that just if we don't keep it in mind, can just run amok of our lives. Where is it arising in our lives and what are we doing about it? Of those 150 individuals, I met like a handful of super shame resilient folks who really shared what they'd gone through and how they'd transformed as a result of that experience. And their brilliance was such a gift.
What did you learn about shame resilience through this conversation?
It was really interesting because it's kind of like, okay, exercise, movement, art, therapy, the same things kept coming up. Psychedelics, which I've never done, but that was a thing that a lot of people had turned to really overcome just really devastatingly shameful in their experience, shameful experiences, difficult experiences that had they not alchemized that shame into something potent and powerful, they would have just been other people. And instead, they were made so much more brilliant as a result of these experiences. They did the work. They found supportive communities. They did individual therapy. They were writers. They were artists. They were public speakers. They had podcasts. They shared the message about the truth of their human experience and invited others to do the same. And they just nurtured that authenticity that was revealed as a result of their presumably shameful experience.
I think that word alchemize is really powerful here, because I think the recipe I'm pulling together from what you said, and it's not dissimilar from the 7 courage practices. There's a ton of alignment in what I'm hearing. And among them is alchemizing our pain into purpose. And another is radical self-care. And I don't know, radical is like a whole buzz thing, but it's really holistic self-care. It's taking care of our body, our mind, our spirit, all of it, our relationships, and it's communicating, it's sharing our stories, it's finding connection. And I think those themes, they're the courage principles, they are the way through shame. This is how we own our stories and feel fully expressed and on purpose in life.
Right. It's shame resilience. The most important step is the reconnection to community, because the trauma of shame is the disconnection.
Not hiding.
That feeling we have to hide who we are, and otherwise we will be expelled. We would not be accepted and we won't be taken care of. So when we begin to turn away from that false belief towards an intuition that we are lovable and good no matter what we've done or what we fear about ourselves to be true, and we start to offer that to a space like a group therapy or individual, another person in a therapeutic setting or creative setting. We start to make art that hints at our worst fears, and it starts to be received positively, or in conversation with a close friend or a loved one, someone that we feel won't reject us. And then they don't. That's when it happens. That's when the powerful stuff happens, because that sense of self grows. And by self, like your best self, we'd start to turn towards her and nurture her. And she gets bigger and braver. And that's something beautiful.
We can do it for one another all the time. And
All
you
the
talk about
time.
in the book in this really beautiful way. You say, when somebody comes to me with their shame, they might start to giggle it off. And I lean in, I open my eyes, I look them directly in the eyes, and I stay with it. And
It's so
really
funny.
honor that place.
I can't believe that's so funny that you're saying this, because I had couples therapy yesterday, and my therapist was offering that to me like a compliment, and I was so suspicious and it was so uncomfortable. But it's true. It's so powerful to be vulnerable in that moment, and to invite someone else to be vulnerable enough to receive that is just sacred. I'm thinking about it today because it was powerful. And even though it felt so awkward and uncomfortable, lean into awkward, be uncomfortable. That's what we're here for.
I have teenage daughters, and they both have social anxiety, and one of them, the worst thing in the world to her is to feel or be perceived as awkward.
My 5-year-old just yesterday was crying, big panic attack at the end of the day, that someone will think she's weird. I don't know who introduced that word weird to her in that context, but like, I'm the weirdest bitch I know, and I love it. I love that identity, but she already knows it's not okay to be weird. I got to talk to her about that.
Yeah. And I think we get to keep talking about it, and we keep using those words as a way of reclaiming them. And we keep saying to our daughters, hey, you want to get weird? Let's get awkward, right? Like, I want to celebrate that. And actually the best stuff in my life is that in my 50th birthday party, which is next week, I have decided that, like, I reached out to the weirdest, most wonderful women I know. And I was like, can we get weird?
Love it.
And I wrote my kids, and I was like, you know what I want for my 50th? I want to get weird.
Yeah, but we have all of these words, right? That we're taught. You're not
put on
allowed
freaking fairy wings and parade through town, howling at the moon. Whatever.
No, I think it's really like part of shame resilience is really about becoming critical of our culture that taught us that weird is wrong, or nag. Like, can we like look at that a little bit more critically and look at the nag with a little more compassion, or all of these other things we're not allowed to be? Can we just start to turn a curious eye on what that is? Why are people that way? Why am I a nag?
Right.
Where's that rage? Or, that don't be an angry woman. Definitely don't be an angry woman if you're a Black woman. Like, there's all of these connotations, and a lot of them are ascribed to women that aren't to men. So like, let's start by noticing, oh, that's really only a rule for women. And then is that really a rule that I want, that I believe in? Do I think people are weird? What do we mean when we say that? What do we believe in? Teaching kids what they believe in, it's such a wonderful way to remember what we believe in as adults. I have young children, and it's just such an experience and opportunity to remember what it means to be human, and what do we value, and what values do we want to water, and what do we want to let die in the dark.
Yeah. And I think your book does that for us. It's an invitation to examine these labels, these beliefs, these thoughts that we've held that have limited us and held us in place and made us feel unseen and unknown and disconnected. I think that was totally redundant what I just said, but it's all true and it bears repeating. And it says, hey, is that what you want? Or do you want to live this experience a little bit differently? And when we talk about you looking into someone's eyes and holding that space for them to share their shame, what you're describing there, I think, is creating the world you want to live in.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that we're right now is just really, like, I do want to acknowledge how difficult so many have it. It's
really hard,
exhausting. And we are in such disagreement. The world feels so fundamentally broken. So to believe that we have any power is almost courageous. Just to imagine, but we do. When we ask someone how they're doing, do you wait for an answer, or do you just expect fine? They're doing fine. We're all fine. Everyone's fine. Do we hold space for each other and ourselves through that pain that we may be encountering?
I didn't think about it until you just said it that way. That part of the power of sharing our shames is that across these differences, we can see sameness.
Yeah. I really like to imagine people in vulnerable states, not to like feel power over them, but to feel sameness.
Yes.
Like people, like I just picture people in their like most pathos. Like we're just like these human flesh sacks doing our best, and sometimes it's our worst. I've been there. I mean, it's hard when you're being like actively harmed by someone to like, feel compassion towards them. But when we're feeling actively harmed by everyone, like a lot of us are right now, I as a woman feel so mistrustful and so in a heightened state of alarm that I don't trust my neighbors anymore. One is to honestly get to know your neighbors. I mean, I said that and I was like,
yes.
Is that literal? Like maybe, yeah, maybe I do need to get to know those neighbors better if I don't trust them. And maybe I do need to see their soft sides and show them mine so that I don't feel so afraid. And so that then we can act from a place of intelligence and emotional intelligence rather than fear. Because right now we are a culture of shame and a culture of fear.
Yeah, we are. And I think we see it in every domain. I'm really, really, really grateful you wrote this book, Melissa. I'm really, really grateful as a woman who shepherds women's stories, as a mother, as a daughter whose mom was radically shaped by shame. I'm really, really grateful you wrote this book. I'm really grateful I met you. And I'm just so grateful we got to have this conversation.
Me too. Thank you. I love doing this. This is like, wow. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks for watching the Uplifters podcast. If this inspired you, hit subscribe and tap the bell to stay uplifted. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs a little lift today. Big love.
Painted water sunshine with rosemary and thyme. Dwell in the perplexing, though you find it vexing. Toss a star and hover, be your own best lover. Relish in a new prime, plant a tree in springtime. Dance with idle hindsight, bring the sun to twilight.
Thanks for watching the Uplifters podcast. If this inspired you, hit subscribe and tap the bell to stay uplifted. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs a little lift today. Big love.
Painted water sunshine with rosemary and thyme. Dwell in the perplexing, though you find it vexing. Toss a star and hover, be your own best lover. Relish in a new prime, plant a tree in springtime.